I'm John Mackenzie. Coming up on Football Today.
He's into double figures for the season. Stephen Fletcher with the clinical finish. And Wednesday turning this game on its head. It's Sheffield Wednesday 2, Brentford 1.
The club have this administrative fight with the authorities. Is it in any way, shape or form a distraction to you and the players?
No, I said it before, our job is to be focused on what we're doing here. That's the football and that's all we can control.
If the charges are upheld and Wednesday gets slapped with a massive points deduction, then it's going to be a big rebuilding project.
In the last few years, we've seen a curious rise in stadium sales in the Championship as club owners purchase their own assets and use the figures to offset their debt. Sheffield Wednesday are one such club. However, in this instance, the EFL are fighting back.
The thing with Wednesday is these issues have been rumbling on for a couple of seasons now.
Nancy Frostick covers Sheffield Wednesday for The Athletic.
I guess the first red flag would be the first transfer embargo they got a couple of seasons ago, which was the first year that I think they had problems with FFP or PNS, whatever you want to call it now.
Think back 18 months ago, and the three of us took our seats at Wembley, hoping this was the day we were going to see Carlos's dream come true, Sheffield Wednesday finally making it back to the big time. I think fair to say that in no one's mind that day was the subject of financial fair play. Now, January 2018, how things have changed.
Really, that's the first obvious moment where fans and journalists covering Wednesday probably thought, there's a bit of a problem here. And then since then, things have snowballed a little bit.
Up and to the point where on the 14th of November, the EFL issue a statement about Wednesday. What is in that statement?
It's basically the EFL charging Wednesday with more than one misconduct charge.
Following a formal investigation into financial information provided by Sheffield Wednesday in relation to the club's 2017-18 profitability and sustainability submission, the EFL has today issued a number of charges relating to alleged breaches of EFL rules.
Essentially outlining that it links to the Sale of Hillsborough and a couple of other things.
The sticking point, as you said, seems to be the Sale of Hillsborough. The interesting thing about the sale is that it's something that we've seen happen quite a lot in the Championship, is from the owner of the club to the owner of the club. Tell us a little bit about what's happened there.
So Wednesday are the first club to be on the receiving end of any charges or sanctions for doing this. Obviously, there's quite a lot of talk about Derby, Villa and Reading have done it as well, where Wednesday seem to have come unstuck, if you can use that term. Nothing's been proven. Wednesday sold the ground to the owner for about 60 million. There's some debate over whether that's a fair valuation. Similarly, there's a lot of debate about Derby, although they've not been charged with anything yet because they sold Pride Park for 80 million, so even more.
I really want a straight answer from you here. Without the stadium sale, would you or would you not have been in breach of FFP?
Well, you plan your whole finances around all the pieces that are moving.
But that's not a straight answer, Mel, and that's what Middlesbrough allege.
Jimmy, it's exactly the same. So you plan your purchases around what your P&L is going to show. And so if you've got a sale of a player at 50 million, you want to utilise that, you do so. If you've got a sale of a stadium, of course, you're going to utilise that, which we did.
In other words, you used a loophole.
No, we didn't use a loophole. There's no loophole here.
There's also an issue with the timings of the accounts. So the account deadline was extended. That was fine. There's no misconduct issue over that. They were allowed to do that. But the stadium sale looks like it's been included in the 2017-18 accounts when there is some debate about when the company that have bought the club was formed, when it's gone through the land registry. And then there's also the issue of repayments for the ground, so the 60 million, how that's spread out. So there's kind of three areas where Wednesday have got to fight with these charges.
Why do you think that the timing of the stadium sale is so important then? Why was it that they tried to push it through to the 2016-17 accounts rather than the season when it allegedly happened?
The main reason will be to make sure that they meet FFP. Without it, I think they'd have been an extra 30 million in debt. So this made sure that they were in the black for the 2017-18 season. Without it, they'd have lost around 30 million, I believe, for that season. And then in previous seasons, they'd lost upwards of 15, I think, in the first season and then 20-something in the second. With the way that P&S or FFP is structured, you're only allowed to lose 39 million over 3 years. They'd have absolutely blown that figure out of the water. So it was critical that they found a way to reduce the loss for that year. In situations when the clock's ticking and it's that or some other sanction for not meeting that figure of 39 million over 3 years, then I guess you have to get creative with how things are done.
You've mentioned another timing issue. That £60 million from the sale of Hillsborough will only be finally paid in 8 years' time.
I think it's something like 12 payments or 12 instalments of the 60 million, which I've been told and I understand is quite irregular for a land purchase or a property purchase. So that in itself, the structure of the deal is a bit odd and a bit different.
And then we've had the issue with value. So the stadium was valued at £60 million, but there have been questions asked about whether or not that's a false valuation, right?
Some people have tried to equate the value of all the grounds that have been sold lately is by comparing it to Upton Park, because that was a real ground that has been sold in the last few years for real money to turn into property, which is where I guess is the best place to get a good measure. I don't think you're going to find land that will go for more of a premium value than in London. If you compare house prices there to house prices in the postcodes around Majeski or around Villa Park or around Pride Park and Hillsborough, it does look like in a couple of those cases, the amount that the stadiums have gone for is probably too much. And I guess when you look at the finances in some of those clubs, you see that it just so happens the amount they've sold the ground for balances the books or pulls them out of that FFP constraint.
What are the potential punishments for this misdemeanour?
The scope is actually quite broad. If the charges are upheld and it's still got to go before an independent commission, it could literally be anything from a slap on the wrist or a small fine all the way up to being thrown out of the league. So the list of sanctions in the EFL's regulations is actually pretty broad. If the charges are upheld, it's more likely to be something like a points deduction. I don't think we're talking the extremes of Wednesday being thrown out of the league or thrown out of the Football League system. That would be really extreme and nobody would want that on any level, I don't think, in football. There's not much precedent in any of this when it comes to stadium sales, but obviously with FFP, Birmingham probably the most comparable case to Wednesday.
We understand Birmingham City have been given an immediate 9-point deduction, which leaves them in a battle to avoid relegation. The club has been punished for breaching financial fair play rules due to excessive spending over the last few years.
Something along those lines, possibly more, because the tariff of points deduction punishments has changed since then, and we're talking a slightly different case with Wednesday. It literally could be anything on that scale of slap on the wrist to kicked out of the league, so it's quite broad.
What was the immediate aftermath of the statement that the EFL put out? How did the club respond?
The club are vigorously defending themselves in this case and they're going to appeal it and fight it with everything they've got. So since that time, we understand that the club were under the impression that the EFL had signed off the stadium sale and had signed off on a lot of these issues that are now coming back and being used in these charges. So it's a case of both the club and everyone involved in the club really taking a strong stance on this and trying to prove their innocence. That is their impression, that they had everything signed off, so they don't see how the EFL can now, after the fact, bring these charges.
What's the timeline from here on in?
Again, Birmingham's probably the best way to gauge that, because I'm sure it's no surprise that things quite often move slowly when it comes to these big institutions. Wednesday have submitted their rebuttal to the charge. They did that last week. Birmingham, it took 10 months, I believe, from when the charges were issued to the point where they got issued with the points deduction. I think we're probably talking months rather than weeks or anything like that. It's whether the EFL or the Independent Commission will push to get something sorted before the end of the season, because then you're moving into the next season and, on the off chance that Wednesday carry on in the form they're in, maybe get promoted via the playoffs, then you're in a tricky situation of how do you regulate a club that's then in the Premier League? Do you try and sneak it through before the end of the season so that that sort of thing doesn't happen? It's quite a tricky one in terms of timelines and where we're at, but I don't think it's going to be before February. It'd be quite surprising, I think, if that's the case.
Have the club given any indication that they have any expectation of what's going to happen?
The only thing we've had to go off is when we've spoken to Gary Monk in press conferences, and he's confident in the club's stance on this and in their ability to fight this. And I think really the focus is all on what's happening on the pitch from their point of view, and they're just happy to go about their business and not panic about this too much at the moment, or at least that's the kind of message they're sending out. The statement that the club put out last week was very strongly worded and, had some real legal terminology in there, and I don't think they'd have issued something like that if they didn't truly believe they had quite a strong footing to argue this on.
What about the fans? What's the general rumbling amongst the fan base about this whole case?
It's quite an interesting one because from people I've spoken to, there's quite a range between blaming the EFL because of how things have gone about, and if it's true that they've approved it once and now they're charging later. There's big questions over EFL governance anyway in so many areas, and I know they're trying to sort of change their stance on things and become more decisive in misconduct issues. But then also other fans I've spoken to have got a real apathy towards the club at the moment and the ownership, and it's a case of wondering why they're in this position in the first place. And really, it's no secret that Wednesday have struggled to meet FFP or P&S. That issue's still there regardless of how this has come about and selling the stadium and everything. So it's kind of a mixed one in terms of issues with broader football governance, but also how their club is being run. And there is genuine concern as well about how this could go. Nobody wants to see Wednesday back in League One or anything like that. And if they got hit with a massive points deduction or an automatic relegation or something of that magnitude, that would just floor quite a lot of the fan base.
So how much of an impact do you think this could have on Sheffield Wednesday and their future?
There are positives that could come out of it, whether the charges are upheld or whether they're unsuccessful. I just think it's a real opportunity for Wednesday to put a plan together of how they want their club to run, to get more people in who really know about running a football club on a day-to-day and really understand the on-field aspect of it. There's not a director of football at the moment at Wednesday. There's not a chief executive. There's not a lot of structure underneath the owner and the finance director between them and Gary Monk. So there's definitely scope for that to be brought in and for the club to sort of assess what type of club they want to be. They've tried the going for broke, throwing everything out, getting to the Premier League structure, and it didn't work, and the repercussions have been quite severe and could be really severe. If the charges are upheld and Wednesday gets slapped with a massive points deduction, then it's going to be a big rebuilding project. We've got a lot of players out of contract at the end of the season, and I think it'll be about how they look to recruit players in the future, because previously they've spent a lot of money on players that have underperformed, or they've spent big wages bringing these people in and it's not quite paid off. So it'll be a chance for a bit of reflection, I think.
These questions about Sheffield Wednesday's sale of Hillsborough raise a broader question about the financial context of the Championship.
Under the old regime, it looks as if the sale of the stadia by both Wednesday, Villa, Derby and Reading had all been approved by the EFL.
Kieran Maguire is a lecturer at the University of Liverpool and host of the Price of Football podcast.
We've now got a new sheriff in town in the form of Rick Parry, and I think he wanted to scrutinise the transactions in more detail.
Why is it the case, do you think, that we're seeing a lot of these sorts of issues with stadium sales in the Championship at the moment?
Before 2016, if you sold your stadium, the profits didn't count towards profitability and sustainability or financial fair play or whatever you want to call it. So therefore, there was no incentive to undertake such transactions. For whatever reason, the rules were changed in 2016, and nobody's ever managed to come up with a sensible explanation for that. I think Reading were the first club to employ such a strategy, closely followed by Derby, Villa, and then finally, when Wednesday's accounts, they came out too. And the advantage of doing so is that it allows you to spend more money on players and pay higher wages and still comply with financial fair play.
How do you expect the Sheffield Wednesday case to go?
A lot will come to the strength of the Wednesday defence. They will argue that as far as they're concerned, that they advised the EFL that the transaction was taking place historically. The accounts have been audited and the auditors are satisfied with the transaction, and I would assume they will have a chartered surveyor's report which has valued the stadium at £60 million. So that will be the basis of the defence. I think the EFL will be looking at the dates of the transactions, the third party support for some of the sale issues, and that will form the basis of the prosecution. And then it comes down to an independent panel to review the evidence put before them. I can only assume that the EFL must feel they've got a very strong case, because if this is successful, then expect others to follow, potentially with regards to other clubs who have undertaken similar sales of stadia.
You've mentioned there are other similar cases to Sheffield Wednesday's rumbling on. Will this ruling function as a precedent in those cases, do you think?
Certainly there will be an investigation into Derby County's sale of Pride Park to another of Mel Morris's companies. There are different issues as far as Derby are concerned, because it was very clear that the sale did take place during the year, and if you take a look at the small print of Derby's accounts, they received £80 million in cash from the sale of the stadium. So there are overlaps, but there are also differences between the two cases.
There's also a timing issue here. The claim is that Sheffield Wednesday have sold their stadium in one season and then debited the sale in a different season's accounts. How can they possibly defend that?
If you've got a contract, and if you've exchanged contracts with a promise to sell the stadium in 2018, then Sheffield Wednesday are in a very strong position. I think a lot will come down to how much backup evidence there is with regards to that. So I think that's going to form the crux of the matter. And that's what I suspect the committee will consist of: an accountant, a QC and an independent third party as well. And that's what they will be examining.
This isn't just any old sale though, is it? Usually sales take place between two different people, whereas this sale is between Dafon Chansiri and Dafon Chansiri.
When normally you have a transaction involving a property, when you exchange contracts, clearly you've agreed a price in advance where one party is trying to get as high a fee as possible and the other one's trying to get a low one. Now, under these circumstances, where effectively Mr. Chansiri is selling to Mr. Chansiri, that tension between the seller and the buyer doesn't exist. And also the fact that there doesn't appear to be a deposit paid, and again, you'd normally expect that to be the case when there's an exchange of contracts, does sort of add to the murkiness of it all. But I would stress, if there is a contract and that is evidence, then I think that could be Sheffield Wednesday's get-out clause.
It feels like the P&S rules are being much more stringently adhered to than UEFA's FFP rules. You've already mentioned Rick Parry wanting to take a hardline stance after Sean Harvey's tenure. Are there any other reasons why this might be the case?
I think that the other EFL chairmen who haven't indulged in such transactions, and I think Steve Gibson's one and Mr. Rizani at Leeds United, they feel quite strongly about this, and they will have been bending the ears of people at the EFL to investigate this further. So there's clearly conflicts between people that own clubs, because some of them feel that the rules have been circumvented by these clubs undertaking these transactions. But ultimately, it was the EFL chairmen themselves who voted to change the rules in 2016.
So has there been any talk about removing the stadium sale clause from the EFL's rulebook? It just seems to cause so many problems.
There's certainly been talk of it. There's an argument for saying that it's a one-off opportunity to indulge in such transactions, and it gives you a 3-year benefit from doing so. So therefore, if they're going to allow it for Villa, Derby, Reading and Sheffield Wednesday, then why can't it apply to other clubs, given that it's effectively a one-off?
Was it only a matter of time before the P&S rules were manipulated?
Well, if you have any rule-based system, there will be silver-tongued lawyers and accountants looking around and looking for weaknesses. You've only got to look at the way that the tax system works. There are a variety of tax avoidance schemes which exist, which have been created, and they have been introduced because the accountants look at the new legislation that comes in, identify a weakness and exploit that weakness. Exactly the same has happened with the P&S rules. They came into being in their present form in 2016. Somebody's been through the small print and has noticed that the sale of football stadia, which by the way is is not allowed for FFP purposes under the UEFA financial fair play rules. For some reason, that particular element has been removed from the rules, and therefore clubs can legitimately sell their football stadiums.
Is it just impossible to impose financial regulations on football clubs then?
I don't really think that they've worked particularly well. If you take a look at when the first form of financial fair play was introduced, which was around about 2013, that particular season, the losses in the Championship were around about £270 million. They'd increased to £580 million by 2018. Therefore, if you look at the two key words, P&S has not delivering profitability because it's actually increased losses, and it's not implementing sustainability because surely for a club to be sustainable on a long-term basis, it needs to have a stadium which it can call its own. And this appears to be encouraging clubs to do exactly the opposite.
Kieran Maguire is a lecturer at the University of Liverpool and can be found regularly on the Price of Football podcast. Nancy Frostick's coverage of Sheffield Wednesday appears at The Athletic. This episode was produced by Josh Schneider-Weiler. I'm John Mackenzie. Thanks for listening to Football Today. If you like this podcast, why not rate and review it on iTunes or share an episode with a friend? See you next time.